Welcome back, guys, to Camilo's Notebooks. Today we're gonna do a little reaction slash slight rebuttal video to to a a recently dropped video by Dr. Edward Frenkel from UC Berkeley. Came out maybe 2 or 3 days ago, where he proposes a very interesting idea. So his main hypothesis is rather compelling, actually. He tries to ground the all mathematical objects, so mathematics, all of mathematics, inside the collective consciousness of humanity, or what he calls the collective unconscious. These are theories of psychoanalysis proposed by Dr. Carl Jung, almost a century ago. I'm not exactly sure the exact date. It's a rather compelling case that he's gonna present. Let's hear, but I will try to get to a slight rebuttal. This idea of grounding it, making it more concrete, making it, mathematical universe exists inside of the collective consciousness of humanity, which is, in a certain sense, obviously correct. There's still a slight, so it is a fairly cool idea, fairly cool, you can say, proposal in the philosophy of mathematics, which is, as most of you know, one of my favorite fields. So, but this idea, kind of what it does is it reduces the mathematical universe of Plato, which deriders of Platonism use kind of slur for the mathematical universe of Platonism. They call it the Platonic Heaven or whatever. He's trying to ground that inside the collective consciousness of humanity, or what he calls again the collective unconscious, but there's still some ontological questions that I will raise in this video. So it will be my slight kind of rebuttal to it, where I think it does a lot of the job, but doesn't completely explain the job. If he could answer the ontological questions that I will raise, then he would almost successfully reduce Platonism, the mathematical universe, into a more concrete kind of thing. Basically, that the mathematical universe just exists inside the collective consciousness, or what he calls the collective unconscious of humanity, but without answering the ontological questions that I will bring up a little bit later in the video. I don't think it completely answers the question of the ontology of mathematics, of the metaphysics, the metaphysics of mathematics, actually, is what I mean to say. So let's hear him out. We're gonna check out some of his theory, and then we will react. Let's see.
I'm going to talk about a unification of two subjects that seem to be far apart, mathematics and psychology. Specifically, the analytic psychology developed by Carl Jung and his school in the 20th century. One of the main tenets of analytic psychology is that each individual mind is connected to a common psychic substrate that Carl Jung called collective unconscious.
I've studied
whose
this
building
before.
blocks are the archetypes, the structures of the psyche that are common and universal to all humans. You may have heard about such archetypes as shadow, anima, animus, and the self. But fewer people realize that in his later years, Carl Jung came up with a truly fascinating idea that the set of natural numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, comes from an archetype. The archetype that he called the archetype of order. So this way, Carl Jung established a link between mathematics and psychology. And in this episode, I'm going to take this idea much further. I'm going to propose that all mathematical objects and all mathematical ideas come from archetypes, come from our collective unconscious. And therefore, mathematics gives us an objective, scientific approach to the study of the human mind, to the study of human psychology.
There is a connection.
While physics is the study of the external physical world, the outer cosmos, if you will, mathematics is the study of our inner mental world, our inner cosmos. And in particular, when we bring mathematical archetypes in our collective awareness, when we integrate them, to borrow the term used by psychologists, new dimensions of reality open up for us. We'll discuss all of this in this episode, and I will present some concrete examples. Welcome to the Aftermath. In episode 1 of the Aftermath, and you can find a link to it in the description of this video, we discussed the remarkable fact that mathematical objects cannot be found in the physical world around us. We do not perceive them with our five senses. Sometimes approximations of mathematical objects could be found in the physical world, as is the case for the objects of Euclidean geometry, such as points, lines, and circles on the plane. But for the vast majority of mathematical objects, there is nothing in the physical world around us that has any semblance of them. For example, in mathematics, we study geometric shapes of arbitrary dimension and even infinite dimensional geometric shapes. And in math, we also study things like esoteric numerical systems like p-adic numbers, infinite dimensional Hilbert spaces, and infinite sets which correspond to the so-called inaccessible cardinals. Not the kind of cardinals that we ordinarily talk about. None of these objects exist in the physical world around us, and yet we have the capacity to imagine them, to conjure them up in our minds. How interesting. In episode 1, I quoted Charles Darwin, who suggested that we perceive mathematical objects through an extra sense. We could call it the mathematical sense of the mind.
About mathematics
and
being like a sixth sense.
This mathematical sense of the mind has a remarkable property. Through it, we perceive all mathematical objects in exactly the same way.
Almost obvious to me.
You and I perceive the mathematical objects of a straight line, as we discussed in episode 1, in exactly the same way. Whereas we perceive physical objects in the physical reality through our 5 senses slightly differently, from different angles, from different positions, and so on. Based on all this, in episode 1, I suggested that our minds must be somehow connected.
And they are connected.
And today we will discuss how this connection could be facilitated. Now, I realize that the idea that our minds are connected may sound outlandish, but in fact, it is one of the main tenets of analytic psychology developed by Carl Jung and his school in the 20th century. Carl Jung suggested that there exists a psychic substrate which is common to all humans, which he called collective unconscious, to which all of our minds are connected. And through this common psychic substrate, through this collective unconscious, we could say our minds are connected to each other. This is similar to how our bodies are all connected to the environment. And through the environment, they are connected to each other. So that's the first idea, the idea of Carl Jung, the idea of collective unconscious. And I'm going to augment it with my own proposal, my hypothesis, if you will, that all mathematical objects and ideas actually reside in the collective unconscious as the archetypes. So there's a lot to unpack here. We should talk about what we mean by collective unconscious, what we mean by unconscious in general, what are the archetypes, what does it mean that mathematical objects and ideas are archetypal, what does it imply, and that's what we're going to talk about in this episode. First things first, what is collective unconscious? Carl Jung himself defined it as follows. Collective unconscious is the part of the unconscious that is not individual but universal. In contrast to the personal psyche, it has contents and modes of behavior that are more or less the same everywhere in all individuals. It is, in other words, identical in all men and women, and thus constitutes a common psychic substrate of a suprapersonal nature, suprapersonal meaning that it transcends personal nature, which is present in every one of us. And then he says, the contents of the collective unconscious are known as archetypes. This word will be like Jordan Peterson in this episode and in the future episodes. So what are the archetypes? Carl Jung's favorite student, well, in my opinion, Marie-Louise von Franz, described them as follows. Jung understood archetypes to be inborn dispositions or unobservable psychic structures that in recurring typical situations produce similarly structured ideas, thoughts, emotions, and fantasy motifs. So the crucial point here is that archetypes are certain structural elements, or you could say building blocks, or persistent patterns of the collective unconscious. And Jung himself studied various examples of archetypes, the most famous of which are the shadow, anima, animus, and the self. We'll talk about the first of them, the shadow, in a moment. But first, I'd like to talk about how to connect Jung's notion of archetypes to mathematics. My hypothesis, is that every mathematical object corresponds to a particular archetype in our collective unconscious. I will call these archetypes the mathematical archetypes. And as we will see in a moment, they have some very special properties. Remember what we discussed just now for general archetypes, that an archetype produces similarly structured ideas, thoughts, emotions, and so on. So my point is that mathematical archetypes produce the mental images of the corresponding mathematical objects in our minds. Or, put differently, when we imagine some mathematical objects, like a straight line, or a plane, or a circle, and so on, what we're doing, we're actually accessing the corresponding archetypes in our collective unconscious, accessing through that mathematical sense of the mind that we discussed. So let's be more concrete and talk about a specific mathematical object, namely the mathematical object of a straight line that we discussed in episode 1. And what I mean is an abstract idealized straight line that has zero thickness, that is absolutely straight, not wiggly, like the approximate lines we find in physical reality, and one that extends to infinity in both directions. I can both imagine this idealized abstract straight line, even though it is nowhere to be found in the physical world around us. And now, my hypothesis is that what happens when we are imagining a straight line or conjuring it up in our minds, we are actually accessing the corresponding archetype, the archetype of a straight line, located in our collective unconscious, you see?
This is just a
or we could say
concrete,
that at this moment,
version of
the
Platonism.
archetype of a straight line is activated and it produces the image of a straight line, the
Well,
mental
with a
image of a
slight
straight
problem
line
I'll bring up in
in
a
our
sec.
minds. A crucial point here is that the source of this idealized, abstract
The source?
straight line can be found neither in the physical world around us nor in each of our individual minds. The source of the straight line that we are imagining in our minds is actually located in our collective unconscious as the archetype of a straight line. That's a good example
true,
of how we interact with mathematical
again,
archetypes,
some
and how
ontological
mathematical archetypes
questions need to
lead
be
us
resolved here.
to imagine or conjure up mathematical objects in our minds. The same, in my view, applies to every other mathematical object. Each of them corresponds to a particular archetype in our collective unconscious. And the point is that these archetypes have a very special property which distinguishes them from other archetypes, and of which there are plenty, obviously. There are many non-mathematical archetypes in our collective unconscious, and I am not suggesting by far that everything can somehow be reduced to mathematical archetypes. Not at all. Mathematical archetypes represent a particular class of archetypes in our collective unconscious. And archetypes of this kind, these mathematical archetypes, have a special property. What is the special property? The special property is that when this archetype is activated, and when it sort of throws an image into my mind, into your mind, and so on, what we're experiencing, what we're imagining, what we are conjuring up is exactly the same. It's exactly the same.
Yeah, just like Platonism.
The archetypes corresponding to mathematical objects are experienced by all of us is exactly the same. Now, that's quite different from how other archetypes that Jung and others have studied are experienced in our human lives. To explain that, let's consider a specific example. The archetype of a shadow. The archetype of shadow...
Okay, so let us continue. So Dr. Frenkel is proposing that the mathematical universe, you know, you can say the mathematical universe of Plato, basically doesn't exist out there, you know, outside of space and time, in the what I call Platonic Heaven, or the world of universe of forms and ideas, or whatever. He's proposing that, you know, like I said, he's bringing it more down to earth. He is saying that it exists actually is in the collective consciousness, or the unconscious collective. I'm going to use these terms interchangeably the entire time. So it, on the surface, it does a very good job. On the surface, it does a very good job of grounding Platonism as just, you know, by grounding, I mean, you know, finding a particular place, because, you know, we've always asked these questions, you know, where do numbers exist? Where do they live? Where do they not come from necessarily, but where do they exist? You know, and Plato, you know, 300 years ago, he suggested, you know, his theory of ideas and forms, and talked about, especially for our purposes, the ideas of mathematics, you know, he said that, you know, there's that forms, you know, there exists an exact form of, say, a circle or a triangle, a perfect equilateral triangle, for which every other object in the physical universe, it's like a imperfect copy of it. So, you know, everybody's heard, you know, the perfect circle doesn't exist. It only exists in our minds. Every other circle that we find in the universe is approximately perfectly circular. But they're all approximations. Approximations to the perfect ideals, forms that Plato said existed outside of space and time, and that everything, they were mere kind of shadows of it, imperfect shadows or imperfect copies, or however you want to phrase it. And like I said, this is great for, like I said, temporarily grounding this Platonic universe into physical reality, because the collective consciousness of humanity exists in physical reality, exists here on Earth. Collective consciousness of humanity is basically the minds of all humans on Earth, kind of, and and all the things they share in common. Certain things, he says, obviously, we share specifically a lot of, or all, actually all, mathematical archetypes, like as he calls them. However, the slight disagreement, or the slight issue I have with this, is that it still doesn't answer the ontological questions of the existence of such objects, of such mathematical structures. So this quickly becomes, one of those little philosophical riddles of, if a tree falls in a forest and nobody's there to hear it, it doesn't make a sound. Basically, if you're not a complete, idealist, Kantian, German idealist or whatever, you're more scientifically oriented, you believe in physical reality, in the physical world. So that if a tree does fall in the forest, it does make a sound. It just, nobody hears it because nobody's around, but it will produce pressure waves pushing the air, which is what sound is. So the problem that I have with Dr. Frenkel's proposal here is that he's kind of suggesting, if we imagine that all humanity was wiped out, let's say instantly, let's say Earth got hit by a comet or some Thanos type snapping and everybody just drops dead, basically the collective consciousness of humanity ceases to exist. And now, that's the problem. If the collective consciousness of humanity ceases to exist, does that mean that mathematical objects and mathematical structures, the idea of a straight line, or the concept of a circle or a triangle or a hyperbolic manifold, whatever you want, does that mean these objects cease to exist with it? If the collective consciousness of humanity goes, then so does all of mathematics, basically. All the mathematical archetypes in the collective consciousness of humanity also just vanish from existence. And I have a slight problem with this because, again, I want to raise ontological questions here. Like I said about the tree and the forest and stuff, and Einstein, for example, he would always say, do you really think that the moon doesn't exist when you're not looking at it? If the moon is on the other side of the planet, does the moon, at least even for you, even if you want to claim to be the most radical idealist, I guess if you do claim to be the most radical idealist, maybe you would say, but nah, we're just living in the Matrix or something, or in a simulation, or one of these kind of nearly debunked theories, because they raise more questions than they answer. They don't really get you anywhere. You can't really make any progress. Just like the idea of God, if God created everything, did he create himself? Or did he need some super God to create the universe? But then super God would need a super God to create the super God, and it becomes an infinite regress, as is known in philosophy and mathematics. So we run into an infinite regress here. So I have a big issue. So in ontology, let's define what ontology is here. Ontology is just the study of what exists, what actually exists. And if you want to say, first let's stick to the physical universe. Okay, yes, I'm pretty sure we all agree the moon exists even when we're not looking at it. But Dr. Frenkel here is suggesting that if humanity was wiped out, the collective consciousness of humanity ceases to exist, then so would mathematics. That means that the idea of a straight line, the concept of a circle, all these things, these mathematical archetypes will also cease to exist. I see a rather big problem with this because there's a funny saying, amongst mathematicians, that every mathematician, working mathematician during the week is a Platonist during the week, but is more of a formalist or a intuitionist or one of the other philosophies of math on the weekends. Or basically saying that, when they're working on mathematics, they like to believe that they're actually discovering. So this question is actually really related to the whole, is mathematics invented or discovered?
I lean more towards the side of discovery, as you can clearly tell is why I'm making this video, because I think that, you know, it's not, we don't invent circles or the concept of a straight line, or the concept of a triangle, or the concept of a topological space, or every mathematical structure. We don't invent these things, okay? We give them names. We invent the notation. We invent the names and the notation for what these objects are that seem to already be in our head. As the archetypes, as the mathematical archetypes, like Frenkel suggests, if humanity ceases to exist with these objects, also would all mathematical objects cease to exist as well. I mean, that's just like saying if the Earth was destroyed, basically, let's say humanity is the only, you know, intelligent civilization in the universe, and Earth was hit by 10,000 comets, I don't know why, and was completely destroyed. Now, if you're a realist, if you're a scientist and a realist, you would say, okay, yes, the Earth doesn't exist, humanity no longer exists, there's nobody out there to see the universe, to witness it, to bear witness to the universe, but the universe would still exist. You know, Mercury would keep going around the sun, and the moon would fly off if the Earth got destroyed, but whatever. You get my point. So this is kind of like my basic rebuttal to Dr. Frenkel, slight rebuttal, because I completely agree with him as in terms of this is a very, very compelling, very, very, I would say, brilliant way of grounding the Platonic universe here on Earth. But so that we don't have to talk about mathematical heaven, we don't have to talk about things, you know, things outside of space-time. We can say, yes, the numbers exist and mathematical objects exist in our collective consciousness. But the idea is that this is, again, a question of discovered or invented. I still think we don't invent these objects. We discover them, and we invent the names and the notation and the etc. for them. But they were there to be discovered to begin with. If they weren't there to be discovered, well, one, we wouldn't discover them, and, you know, just the fact that we are here talking about it means we have discovered them. The question is, did we discover them or did we invent them? And again, I'm arguing that we actually only invented, again, the names, the notation, but the actual mathematical archetypes, the actual mathematical structures of the Platonic universe or whatever, do seem to exist. It's hard to, even as a scientist, it's hard to say, seem to exist outside of space-time. I mean, this is a question that's baffled philosophers and mathematicians and scientists for millenniums. You know, where do numbers come from and how do we have access to them? So now, through Frenkel's idea, through his hypothesis, we understand now, we have a very good understanding of how we access them, why they're the same for everybody. This is all, you know, very straightforward. He merely placing the Platonic universe inside the collective consciousness of humanity still doesn't tell us anything about the ontology of these objects. So I'm proposing that Dr. Frenkel's hypothesis does a decent job of grounding, again, the Platonic universe inside the collective consciousness of humanity, but it's like a temporary solution to this discovered, invented / Platonic universe outside of space-time problem. It's like a temporary solution. If we deeply analyze this, we'll only fall into an infinite regress of where these concepts exist, just like how I mentioned before. And so, in a sense, it doesn't nullify, it doesn't falsify Dr. Frenkel's hypothesis, but it just puts a really big asterisk next to it. It again, it's like it's a temporary solution. It's like a band-aid on the question, on the problem. It does not really do the full job like I was mentioning at the beginning of the video, of completely describing exactly where mathematical objects or mathematical archetypes exist. Well, now the archetypes, yes, okay, they exist inside the collective consciousness of humanity, but when you analyze that even further, you just fall into an infinite regress. So I'll end it here. I think I made my point. Please, if you have any useful insights into this issue that we're discussing, because this is very important. I mean, this is one of the deepest, most important questions in the philosophy of mathematics: the invented versus discovered, and it's just Platonism in general. And so, yeah, my slight rebuttal is like just Dr. Frenkel's hypothesis. Although it is a working model, it's a working hypothesis. It does the job. It does a particular job, and it works very well at that particular job, but it doesn't fully answer the real questions, which are the ontological questions. So yeah, let me know if you have any insights into this. Please leave them in the comments. I'll read all of them, and any good ones, I'll highlight them, and even if they're good enough, I'll make a follow-up video to continue this discussion, because the philosophy of mathematics is one of my favorite fields in all of human thought. It's, to me, one of the most important fields, because I'm an agnostic atheist. I don't believe in anything supernatural. I'm a complete naturalist. I don't believe in anything supernatural. So no ghosts, no fairies, no any of that. So everything that doesn't exist as a, when I put my physicist hat on, anything that doesn't exist within space-time is just simply non-existent. There's nothing to talk about. Except for mathematics. Except for mathematics. Mathematics and things like numbers are the only things that seemingly exist outside of space-time, but not only do we have access to them and use them, and the unreasonable effectiveness of math in the natural sciences, Wigner's quote, these numbers and mathematics and geometry and shapes and all these things, they're the only thing that I cannot physically point to or touch or anything. They don't exist anywhere in space-time, meaning at any one place at any particular some particular time. They don't exist anywhere in space-time, yet we talk about them every day, we use them every day, our world runs on them. We would be incapable of building a civilization without them, really. Fairies and ghosts, all that is out the window. I'm a complete naturalist. But mathematics is the only exception for which I still haven't found a convincing answer to this question. So how is it that these things exist not within space-time, not in the physical universe that I live in? I live in the physical universe. I hope you do too. Really, I don't even hope, we all do. Yet mathematical objects seem to be the only things that are ghostly, or kind of like ghosts, but actually are real. They're like the only real supernatural things, because not supernatural, they are as natural as the natural numbers, but they don't exist within space-time. But I can't take anybody serious who's gonna say, oh, the numbers don't exist, or numbers, or geometry, shapes, anything. These things don't exist. So for the final time, leave a like, leave a comment, specifically if you have some insight into this question. I would love to read it, and I would love to make a follow-up video if I hear any good responses or any good ideas in this direction. So yeah, that's my argument. Dr. Frenkel is kind of like a temporary, almost superficial, like on the surface, it fixes the problem of this, Platonic universe that doesn't exist inside space-time. He grounds it inside the collective consciousness of humanity, but still leaves all the ontological questions completely unanswered. And these ontological questions, the second you try to answer them using only the collective consciousness of humanity, you're going to run into this infinite regress, and that's it. And once you reach an infinite regress, the conversation is over. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you guys liked it. It's a rather interesting topic, and I hope to make more of these videos on the philosophy of mathematics. Goodbye.